Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles to Angelo Robles' Effective Family Office podcast, where I look to distill the best practices and best ideas of the world's most successful families and their family offices. I hope to provide thought-provoking opinions and feature amazing thought leaders to our listeners of the podcast with an eye towards the future of the family office. Today's podcast is titled Impact Investing Through Crisis, Ways Your Wealth Shapes the World. It features Jen Kenning, the CEO and co-founder of Align Impact. Jen is noted as the CEO and co-founder of Align Impact. She has been a trailblazer in the impact space for the past decade and brings with her almost 2 decades of working with family offices, the ultra-affluent foundations and institutions, developing solutions that use a spectrum of capital to transform society so the world works for all 7.8 billion people and not at the expense of the planet. So it's really exciting to have Jen on the show. Let's give her a warm welcome. Jen, it's great to connect. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And to give people maybe a little bit of extra context, I think this is my 103rd, 104th podcast. We've never covered directly. It came up indirectly. Shame on me. We've never covered the concept of impact investing. So we do want to get a little bit foundational so people, especially that may be listening in the future via podcast, have a grounding and a foundation in it. And I will say, and I know a little stereotypical, but over the last year or so, we've been very active in next generation initiatives. We even had a complete initiative dedicated to it. And no question, the youth of great wealth and resources are gravely concerned, much, much more than older generations like mine, and good for them, relative to social outcomes, to climate change, to issues that are really, really important to people. So this is really an important topic. And to give a little bit of a shout out, although when this comes up on a podcast, it'll be too late, but a little treat for you all listening in live, as well as those that see it on YouTube. On Friday, hope I got my date right, May 15th, so next Friday, we have Jeremy Grantham on, who's one of the most iconic investors of all time and extremely active, and actually really all he's going to talk about. Well, we'll get a little more from leadership and cultural development out of him, but it's going to be focused on climate change and what he does inside his very significant foundation. So we're very excited next week to cover the topic effectively again after not doing it for hundreds of episodes. Now we'll have an almost back-to-back. Jen, why don't we jump right into it? Let's define what you mean by impact investing.
Great. Well, I'd like to first say that you're actually an early adopter still at this point. So
hard to believe, but I'm glad I am.
And never. So what we mean by impact investing is a couple things. One is that you're intentionally seeking both a financial return and measuring the impact, either socially or environmentally or both. And I want to point out the key words there. There's an intentionality, right? You're going beyond just the financials. You could be getting a concessionary return for the level of risk you're taking, but you're getting an outsized impact on the measurable side. And so it's really intentionality, achievable, measurable, and you're looking at those. I'd also like to say that I believe impact is deeply personal to each individual. It's deeply personal to each family. And that each individual inside of a family structure needs to define what they mean by impact. And ultimately, the family needs to define it as a collective unit. It's not one size fits all. So your definition of impact versus my definition might be different. Neither one is right or wrong.
How can families take this on if they're just new to the conversation of impact?
Yeah, I always like to say, start with your why. Start with what drives you. Where do you have angst in society? Where are you disappointed? What family events have you had that have really steered the course of your family unit? Usually inside of your why is the solution that you're trying to tackle for the world. People tend to make this more complicated than it needs to be. And I often say that the gold or the gems are really inside of the things that already keep you up at night or already drive you to do something different in the world. So start with a conversation around the dinner table, especially in light of the current environments. If you're sheltering in place together, start with, if you could change the world with just one thing, what would it be and why? And I bet you'll be surprised at what some of the other people say around the dinner table.
Jen, where is the best place for people to start based on the desired outcomes that they wish to see?
Yeah, so when you identify your why, let's say that you're looking at the health disparity in the United States right now in light of the current environments. You want to start to look at who is your ultimate beneficiary? What are your geographic targets? What are you trying to accomplish? Start with building out a really sound strategy. Think about you're building your house, right? You're going to hire your architect and then you're going to build the foundation before you're actually going to figure out what furniture and wallpaper and all the extra things you need. Start with what you're trying to do and then start building out, well, what are the potential solutions that exist? So if we talk about healthcare disparity, and maybe you want to go one step deeper and you want to take on access to mental health without having to go to a mental health provider. Let's start with, do they have internet access? Is it democratized? Who am I trying to get this access to? You can pick any topic area and then you can start to look to say, what would potential solutions look like? And then you can map those solutions to how would I invest in those solutions? And then from there, and we can get into this a little bit deeper, is how do I take those potential solutions and potential investment opportunities and map them across different entities I may have inside the family office? Each entity has different objectives. When you think about your foundation, for example, you have grant capital and you have investment capital. You're 95% inside of a private family foundation. You're going to want to take early stage risk or innovation risk or new technology risk inside of maybe your grant capital. Maybe you do a program related investment. That's technical. I can absolutely go back and describe that. Or maybe it's already a proven technology that you want to invest in a later stage company. You want to invest in their Series B or C or even F rounds. You may do that from the corpus because you're not going to take on as much risk as you would have taken on when they were an earlier stage company. So it's really no different, Angelo, from how you build out your investment portfolio on the traditional side. I often think you have to take all the same principles when you're starting to build this out, and then you overlay the things you care about, your values, your why, the things you're really trying to drive in society on top of your investment preferences.
So really thinking about it from a classic investing perspective, a family would likely broadly have goals. They would develop an investment policy statement setting certain parameters. They would develop an asset allocation plan, more commonly either strategic or tactical, but it could get a little more complex than that. But then it comes down to the execution and the choice of how they're going to invest. If they're more active as direct investors, they effectively have complete control as a direct investor of the process. But more families are going to be outside of maybe some investments directly in public securities, which are easy enough, but are going to allocate to what they think are best in breed managers. Mm-hmm. How do you address the issue of the perception? I'm sure it's wrong, but the perception of, I have issues that are important to me that I would like to have aligned with our values and how we invest, but I don't want to have my portfolio get lesser returns because of that.
Yeah.
And that must be a really tough decision, or perceived as being a tough one. Has that improved lately?
It has. So we actually have more than a decade of data, both on the public side and the private side, from academic institutions, data providers, major financial institutions, that actually demonstrate you don't have to sacrifice return. It's one of the myths that I'm constantly dispelling. And so I think, but before we even go to the actual looking at a manager strategy, you have to ask yourself, what is the intention of this bucket of assets? Or I like to say lever. What are we trying to do with it? What kind of return do we need to generate to accomplish our family goals? So for example, if you're looking at the living trust of the first generation, you're going to take very different levels of risk than you may take in an exempt trust or even in a foundation, right? That are for future generations,
For sure.
20 to 30 years from now. They may have different tax consequences. And so you really want to look at building out the plan for each entity and each entity's impact investment policy statement, and then match the right opportunity to what you're trying to accomplish in each of the asset allocations within each entity. When we talk about market rate returns versus concessionary returns, because this comes up all the time, oftentimes people actually aren't aware of what they're actually earning. So many times they're like, to be quite frank, I don't know what my current portfolio is actually earning. Is it market rate or is it not, right? I don't have really great context for that. Usually we compare it to normal benchmarks, right? Benchmarks that maybe the family office set out, or maybe standard benchmarks. We do the exact same thing. We actually look at the same benchmarks that they would look at on a traditional investment, and we're comparing the impact investment to their traditional investments, because we don't believe you actually have to sacrifice return. In order to not sacrifice return, you got to be really intentional about how you do diligence, how you look for opportunities, and how you map across kind of assets and liabilities, right? When I say liabilities, I mean this entity needs to generate an 8% return. We need to make sure we're putting an asset in that entity that has the ability to generate that kind of return over the investment horizon. So as much as it might sound like it's different, it's actually not. I think what is different is twofold. One is we're going one level deeper, right? Once we acknowledge that the financial return is similar, we're then looking at, well, what's the impact environmentally, socially, and from a governance standpoint? And then in some cases, we're even going a level deeper from that to look at, well, how are they using the use of proceeds? What does the company culture look like? You'll hear Jeremy talk about this a lot, right? Is what does the company culture look like? How do they treat their people? How do they look at their supply chains? So we're really diving into multiple layers while we're going through this process.
Do families usually know where they want to invest and ultimately who to benefit? You somewhat answer that, but let's do a little bit of a deeper dive into it.
Yeah, I would say it's mixed. There's plenty of families that we've worked with and that I've interacted with over almost 2 decades that don't know what they want to invest in. They're actually very open to cross-sector investing, right? Let's look at the ultimate beneficiary and let's bring that beneficiary affordable housing, access to healthcare, access to good schools, after school programs, safety, security. We're looking at the beneficiary rather than we're looking at one sector. Sometimes families come at it as, I would like to just look at the best of the best. I want to look at it the best of the best from climate or the environment or social. And I want to invest in the best managers across asset classes. And I don't need to dig into a specific sector of healthcare, education, or housing per se. There isn't a right way to do this. It really is what drives you. What I find is that people often have an aha moment. They have a moment where they say, wow, I love this investment. I love what we're doing here. I love when I get to look at it quarterly or annually, or I actually see what's going on. I want more of my portfolio to look like this. And so you got to start somewhere. I often say, start kind of by dipping your toes in the pool and at least getting educated. And I don't mean that derogatory at all. It's more of just look to see what else is out there, right? You can invest in old models, or you can invest in the models that we believe are the future economy. We believe this current crisis, pandemic, is a precursor to climate and to other things we're going to face over the next 1 and 2 decades. And private foundations, private families, family offices play a huge role in getting that capital to where it needs to be to build the future economy that really is going to have us all thrive.
From the outside looking in, and without giving this a lot of thought, you have many families that are going to have a private foundation that may be dedicated to causes that are important to them. And really, that's all that matters. No matter on what spectrum it's on, this is what they're considering sort of making an impact. But where it gets to be a little bit of a disconnect in my mind is if their core investing and even what's driving their revenue outside of their foundation has no thought whatsoever to impact investing. Yeah, it's better than nothing that they got a foundation, it's investing in a certain way and distributing resources, but it's not perfectly aligned. They're not fully aligning how they invest outside the foundation, how they generate revenue, their legacy, their heritage, and how they want their footprint on the world to be perfectly aligned with their foundation and initiatives. There's a little bit of a disconnect. And then sometimes you'll hear, well, I need to drive the most revenue so I could do the most in my foundation. True, but you're offsetting some of the benefit that you want to do in your foundation to begin with. Am I wrong in this assumption?
You're not. So a couple of things. First, there's $1.1 trillion between private foundations and donor advised funds. $1.1 trillion. That money was set aside for public good. It's actually one of the easiest places for families to start. Most families, their corpus, the 95% that's in the investment bucket, is misaligned with their grant making. So it's contradicting what they're doing with the 5%. When they start to just even do an underlying audit of how is the 95% invested, that is an amazing place to start because it at least has you know what you own and it has you be able to see, hey, I'm over here fighting climate or environmental issues with 5% of my dollars, but my 95% is completely eradicating it, right? Even based on where we bank and where our institution is and how they loan their money out. And so that is a great place for people to start. The second myth I want to dispel in what you brought up is people say, I want to make money in the first half of my life or with my 95%, and then I want to give it away in the latter half of my life or with the 5% grants. The reality is you can actually do both, right? They can actually be working simultaneously in parallel. And the reality is some of the things that we face globally that we're putting philanthropic capital to require investment capital. They require infrastructure capital, right? Let's use water, for example, access to clean water. We can make this debate in the United States, in Flint, Michigan, California, and other places as much as we can make it in the developing world. 795 million people don't have access to water, yet we continuously throw philanthropic capital getting them access to water. It's actually an infrastructure issue. We need to build real infrastructure with real systems, with a distribution and a payment collection that will survive 20 years and longer with that investment. Much better use of capital than using our grant capital. Yet we misappropriate the grant capital. Same thing with food systems. The list goes on and on and on. We could do 5 podcasts, one on each system, right? Because we need to start using more public-private partnerships or using the right type of capital to solve the problem we're trying to solve. And families miss out when they don't look at the 95% and they're only focused on their grant capital. Not to mention they have other tools inside their grant budget that they may not be using as well.
And over a decade ago, what made you get involved in impact investing? What was your why?
So that's a longer question as well. I'll give you the shorter version. So I ran 20, multi-generational families in a multi-family office practice. I really loved what I did, but I struggled with severe depression in my late 20s as I was climbing the corporate ladder. And so I started working on Skid Row with the homeless population in Los Angeles, probably the largest homeless population in the US. And I started to see how systems were broken, how the local government, the state government, the federal government, grants, investments didn't work together. The systems were failing. We were creating new problems. I started seeing this really very clearly. And then I'd go to work during the day and I would work with really affluent families and I'd help them define their why and what they cared about. And I realized that they were looking for purpose and meaning and something to get behind and wanted to do it more intentionally. And so it started to blend, right? It wasn't just something I did at nights and on the weekends. It started to be a conversation that I started having with clients and families. And then in 2008, 2009, two of my families came to me and said, we want to be better philanthropists, quite frankly. They're like, we want to do something different. We don't want to just write checks. We feel like we're treadmill givers. We're constantly doing what we've been doing for a decade. We want to get our children involved. We want to look at the world. We want to see kind of how does the world exist outside of Silicon Valley, right? Or Los Angeles, California. And so I started to weave these two worlds together. And before I knew it, I was like, wow, this is what I've been doing for 10 to 11 years. This was meant so that I could help families uncover what they care about and then pave new paths forward. I actually, Angelo, set out to find a firm that could partner with us, that could co-pilot with us, that could be a consultant, that could be an investment advisor on the impact side. And after many it's failed attempts, in 2013, I went to Africa with one of those families in their next gen. I saw 12 social enterprises and I didn't come back the same person. So I said, you know what? I'm going to leave to go build a firm that really meets the client where they're at, that focuses on the client's why and really has the client be front and center, not an investment product or a charity, but more, what are we trying to do today and what are we trying to instill in our next generation or future generations? And how do I help multiple generations of one family move the dial while they're alive, right? That's key. Because a lot of people wait until they pass because they say, well, there'll just be more money then and the kids can figure out what to do with it, rather than they get to do it in harmony collectively as a family unit.
Right, which looking at what Warren Buffett and what was it, Bill Gates and the Giving Pledge certainly means that you're seeing an immediate value of what you're doing starting to work. And the family involved in that process, I'm assuming as well. Are there various themes you're seeing amongst families that are starting to emerge now in impact investing?
Yeah, we're starting to see families use a blended capital spectrum of capital. So they're using all different types of capital to accomplish what they're setting out to do. We're also seeing families do it together. So families come together and they co-invest in deals together so that they can learn from each other. We're seeing families that are putting together next generation programs with other families where they train generation 3 or 4. Right. And we're training on general financial topics as well as impact investing. We're giving carve outs to the next generation and allowing them to actually deploy that capital. So we're seeing families collaborate more than operate in silos. I think this is a much more effective way to do impact investing rather than doing it on your own. There's a lot of families that have already paved the way that you can learn from. There's a lot of resources out there. And I think sometimes what I hear most from families is, how do I decipher what's real from the noise and help me scale it back? I only have so much time in the day. And so I do think the collective is where we're seeing it. I think families are starting to say, I want to do work in the US. I want to fix broken systems here. If we're US based, if they're European based or Asian based, they want to look at their local community or their domestic community. So you're starting to see a lot more place based investing than maybe we've seen over the last decade. And then really refining kind of the area of focus so that they're not spread out all over the place, right? That they get really niche and focused in one sector and they may build a bespoke model around that sector.
And drilling that a little further in terms of what you're seeing as trending as a top 5 or 10, we already mentioned briefly climate change. I'm assuming inequality issues in company corporations is another. What would be a couple of others that you're starting to see more commonly?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for asking it. One is affordable housing. We already had a shortage of affordable housing prior to this crisis. It's going to even be higher post. So we're seeing that people really understand real estate. A lot of families made their wealth in real estate or in an operating business that they understand. And so that's a budding area we're seeing. We're seeing affordable housing and then putting wraparound services around that affordable housing so that you can actually fix the other services that we believe should complement not in addition to the affordability piece. Like you saw in 2019 around straws and single-use plastic, We see that you're starting to see resource efficiency and circular economy, and our supply chains are very much interconnected. If COVID hasn't taught us that, I'm not sure what it's taught us. We're interconnected, right? What you do affects me. What we do affects someone in the UK, which affects someone in Asia. We're also a global economy. Our supply chains are interconnected. And so we have to start looking deeper at that. So I think resource efficiency, supply chain management, I think some of the two biggest areas that I said were big areas prior to COVID, and I believe they're still big areas post-COVID, are food. The food system was already in front and center, not just to mention health issues, but also water usage as well as animal welfare. So you've got multiple things happening there. I often tell my baby boomers and mature clients who aren't like, Jen, I don't really love impact and I don't want to talk about sustainability, I just want to make money, that they can make a lot of money over the last 7 years in alternative proteins and alternative meats and alternative to dairy and lots of different areas inside of food. I think food, what we put in our bodies, where it's processed, the distribution of it, the supply chain is going to be the next thing over the next 12 to 18 months where I think investors have huge opportunity. And then the other sector I see massive opportunity is fashion, and just the waste that we use and how much goes in our landfills, and how do we repurpose it and be more mindful.
What levers do families have beyond their grant and investment dollars to drive solutions they wish to see that may not be so apparent?
Yeah, I mean, I always like to say the two lowest hanging fruit that are not investment dollars per se are consumption. Like, where do you spend your money? What do you consume? What kind of businesses do you support? Really look to say, what am I supporting here by making this purchase decision? Women make 80% of the purchasing decisions, so they do play a role here. It's also just being aware of what's behind this product or service. The other area is engagement, civic engagement, political engagement, even corporate engagement, right? You don't, engaging with corporations is how we're going to change them, right? It's how we're going to have them shift. And that's super important as we come out of this and as we build over the next decade, right? How do we shift the focus from just profits to profits, people, the planet, and purpose? And you can do that by raising your voice, both with consumption dollars and with even engaging with the company. You can engage with companies if you own as little as $2,000 of their stock. So there's lots of different ways you can join movements today to engage.
There was another acronym, I guess, that was more common a couple of years ago, but just to clarify for my audience, is there a difference between impact investing and SRI, socially responsible investing? Or simply has impact investing became the new term that overtook SRI?
I'm so glad you asked that. So it's a great question. So SRI is social responsible investing for the listeners. And it actually has been around for a long time. Like, we could go all the way back to the Quakers. It was very popular in the 70s and 80s with the divestment movement of South Africa from Coca-Cola, the apartheid. So social responsible investing is usually associated with negative screening. So you're screening out companies that are negatively aligned with your values. So if you're an environmentalist and you want to go fossil fuel free, you're going to screen out the 200 oil and gas coal companies that may be inside your portfolio. You could also be someone who's anti something else, abortion, pornography, controversial issues, right? Smoking, alcohol, tobacco, etc. Usually they take a negative approach. What they do is they screen out that company, and we say that's just one piece of it, right? If you're going to screen out the company, you also need to engage with the company, because the only way the company changes behavior is if you actually change their behavior by letting them know, I'm divesting, but I'm also still here to vote so that your behavior changes. They don't know if you divest out of the stock because it's usually not material enough. But if enough of us did it and we had collective impact, it could really have a movement. The divestment movement of fossil fuels is the largest and fastest ever in history. I want to just about one more thing around SRI. SRI got a bad rap in the 80s and 90s because it did underperform. If you divested out of oil when oil was at its high, you're going to naturally underperform. And so people have this connotation that you underperform when you take a divestment approach or a negative approach. And we would argue you need to take a divestment approach with an engagement approach, and then you need to take the capital you just divested from and deploy it into things that you actually care about, like investments that are going to do the opposite of what you just divested out of.
That would certainly be true. A really important question to me, and almost hinted at it in my open. How do you build bridges between the generations of the families and how they may be better aligned in their values, but they perhaps come at it from different perspectives and objectives?
Yeah, great question. So one is knowing your audience and also understanding each person's role and what they're trying to articulate. Oftentimes families are very aligned, no pun intended. They're just talking over each other. So generation one has a perspective on the world. Usually they grew up in the Great Depression or a product of the Great Depression or have had that experience. Very different from generation four, right? And so they see the world differently because of where they sit and what their experiences have been, right? Mm-hmm. Second is they see the world differently because technology was different, right? They had access to different things. They also play different games. So matureds, baby boomers, generation 1, 2, or 3, or even 4 in a longstanding family, the game has always been making money, right? Operating successful businesses, investing in things that are going to get you an outsized return. That can still be the game. But generation 4, 5, 6, or 7, generation X, millennials, generation Z, they actually care about that, but it isn't the driver. Sustainability, equal voice, raising their voice, their place in the world. They're interested in different things. That's going to drive front and center. So the sustainability and how the company treats their employees is going to drive more than what is the stock dividend or the price to earnings ratio. So usually when I'm working with families or when I'm, in an interactive dialogue with family offices, I say, consider you're already at the same place. You're just talking over each other. So use the language that's going to have each generation get to their own aha, right? I can't tell you how gratifying it is when I work with generation 1 or generation 2 and they have their aha and then they start to work with their children, grandchildren, or great grandchildren. And they get to say, I finally get what you've been talking about, right? So again, I think it comes back to communication, language, and then creating a safe space for everyone to articulate what's there for them and being open and inquisitive and curious about the way another generation sees it. Because in a sense, Angela, we've lost the art of storytelling across families, across multiple generations. I like to say this is a way of bringing it back because maybe the grandparents have actually never talked about what it was like coming out of World War I or World War II. Now is an opportunity for them to do that and to impart wisdom on their grandchildren or great-grandchildren.
It's a great answer. Do you believe the current framework to respond to COVID-19 contrast with from how you would approach impact investing normally?
We don't, because we set out these strategies in some cases a decade ago and now they're proving out. We really believe we were already headed on this trajectory. Some people said we were going to have fires and pandemics like we're seeing and natural disasters 50 years ago that are coming to fruition. And just so the audience knows, I'm an eternal optimist. I believe we can eradicate poverty and climate change by 2050 in this lifetime. I just believe we need new systems to do it, and we need investment capital to complement our philanthropic capital, and we need public-private partnerships to do so. So I don't think the framework is very different. I think we're shining a lens on what doesn't work in this country and across the globe, and that we need to innovate and we need to invest in infrastructure that we've deferred in some cases for 40 plus years, and that families and private investors have a huge opportunity over the next decade, not only to be rewarded financially, but to have a profound impact on what the future looks like for future generations. And so I don't think the framework has shifted so much as it has given us a glimpse. And it's a little bit like us on training wheels. I believe this isn't going to be the only pandemic we're going to have, Angela, over the next 100 years, because we really haven't seen one since 1918 like this, at least not in the United States. I think we're going to have more of them more frequently. I hope our response is better and that we're more resilient. And I think that comes from making better investment decisions that use history to tell us how that investment should perform, but uses the future economy and where we're going and the things we're going to have to tackle that are unprecedented, that we didn't have to tackle 40 years ago, as a guiding post to how we get there, right? And I think this is just a precursor to climate, and I believe climate and social are very much intertwined, and you can't separate the two, right?
Right.
No matter how much money we have or a family has, you can't buy your way out of the current situation. And it's going to be the same for the environment and other social and environmental issues we're going to face over the next 1 and 2 decades.
What can families do in the short term, intermediate, and the long term around the current environment?
Great question. So short term, I would say look at your existing grantees, your existing partners, people you already know really well, and start to look to say, what can I do to help them weather this storm? How can my capital, my resources, my network, my skills, a lot of the family offices have extraordinary skills that could be so beneficial to startups, to companies, to around how do they pivot quick enough and innovate during this time. So look at your existing portfolios, your existing grantees, reach out to them, ask, how can I help? If you don't want to help with capital, say, how can I help beyond capital? What's your greatest need besides money? We know you need money, but what else do you need? In the intermediate, look to see what are good investment opportunities and philanthropic opportunities. What PRIs, program-related investments, can you make from your 5% that are concessionary, but they're hugely catalytic with your 5% dollars for the next 2 to 5 years to help rebuild the system? Can you loan to CDFIs, who tend to loan to underprivileged or underbanked populations, places where you're not going to get to through mainstream capital? In the long term, continue with your strategy, right? Look at how much was I going to put in private equity? How much was I going to put in real estate? How much was I going to put in venture cap? And then you ask yourself, what kind of companies do I want to invest in for the future economy? Where would I put my money? It might look very different than it did 2 months ago, right? It might be companies that can pivot to virtual immediately. It might be companies that are consumer goods facing or services that simplify our lives that allow us not to have to go out. So you think about, where do I see future opportunities and things I may know, and start there. I often say families of great wealth and family offices usually have expertise in 1, 2, or multiple issue areas, because they built operating businesses that have stood the test of time. They've stood great wars, pandemics, depressions, recessions, etc. And you have that operating experience that translates to this time.
What is the current crisis teaching us about what we face with climate change in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, I already mentioned one thing. It's none of us can buy our way out of this, right? So there's not like I can get on my jet and go somewhere. I mean, where are you going to go? Pretty much the world's locked down. I think, one, we're seeing in some places the cleanest air we've seen in 40, 50, or 60 years, if ever. Look at Beijing, Hong Kong, Los Angeles, San Pablo. I can go on and on and on. We're seeing less asthma, less other lung issues already in a very short period of time, 6 to 8 weeks. Nature's resilient. Look at all the animals coming back out. Look at the animals that we're starting to see inside of the oceans and rivers, on our lawns. I mean, we're seeing llamas in Los Angeles. We're like, where did they come from? right? Where were they hiding? We're seeing mountain lions coming out in great strides in San Francisco. While that might terrify some, just know that nature and animals are resilient. If we allow them to regenerate, they will regenerate, right? They will stand the test of time. It's we humans who oftentimes get in the way. We're also seeing that we said it was going to take decades to curb our behavior. Well, we curved our behavior in the last 6 to 8 weeks. While some people have taken it more seriously than others, we've actually shifted how we function as society, right? We've shifted to we all need to get in a car or on mass transit and go into a commercial building and do our jobs. There are plenty of jobs. I think it's 63% of the jobs can be done from home. They're not essential to go to a physical space. Only 37% of the global economy is really essential in going to a physical space. And I think we have to leave farmers out of that because that's a whole different equation, right? But we have a lot of opportunity that this is teaching us that should escalate how we respond to this and how we respond to the green economy or climate in the future. Last thing I'll share is we have to invest in the recovery and in the future in a green manner, right? We can't go back to the way it was. The planet can't sustain it. As I said, I'm an optimist, but we know we've been having once in 100-year floods every year, more hurricanes, fires everywhere. And it's not just California, it's Australia, it's the rainforest. We're starting to see it impact people beyond just land. And so I do think we have to be really cognizant, especially family offices, around really being a demand for us investing in the future in the most green way possible.
We're heading to the home stretch. I'm going to have one final question that will give you a chance to close. And again, we do have a strict time limit today. Those that are listening in live, and we do have a live audience, if you wanted to use the chat feature to ask a question, we may not have an opportunity to get to it, but we might. So if you wanted to shoot one over via the chat feature, feel free to. As I wrap up, I would ask, where do you see the most opportunity for families to shape the future? Perhaps you have a couple of examples you could give us.
Yeah, let's start with green infrastructure, right? New water systems, new utility systems, look at green bonds, look at green real estate, things that renewable energy, wind and solar farms. There's a plethora of opportunities across asset classes. If you're looking for more social, I'd say let's look at our social inequalities that we face globally. It's not just wealth inequalities, it's income inequalities, it's healthcare inequalities. These systems are all intertwined. Look at who can you help actually change the trajectory of their life because you made a small investment in them. It could be anything from grants to microfinance to income sharing agreements to subsidize housing through Section 8 and affordability. It could be access to internet so that they can actually do homeschooling or they can actually do distance learning in New York City. New York City, most of the lower income families don't have access to the internet or have access to devices. So it really made it a challenge for New York City to go to remote learning. These problems aren't just US focused. They're in Africa, India, Central and Latin America. There's almost nowhere where you couldn't find an opportunity. And I do believe if you do the same due diligence and rigor you do in your traditional investments, you'll be able to find opportunities in the impact landscape that not only inspire you, but actually have the ability to make you money and change the trajectory of someone else's life.
Excellent. I actually do have a final question. Let's keep the answer so you could give a proper close and how people could learn more about you and the work that you do. We'll keep it to 1 minute. There was a question that came in that we did address already relative to the giving pledge. So sorry, I'm going to skip over that one that was asked. When you hear the podcast, you'll be able to hear that answer. But how can families, and I know you kind of answer this, and I'm limiting the time, I realize, but how can families with wealth shape the world today? And importantly, be rewarded monetarily for doing so?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at your public portfolio, your private investments. There's plenty of opportunities for you to invest to do dual purpose. I'm happy to also take whoever asked that question or have a expanded answer. There's really no place you can't find an opportunity, Angelo. So I would say to the audience, look at where you tend to feel like you're really comfortable investing, you're great at investing in that sector, and then look to say, what would the future of that sector look like? What is the future of work? What is the future of food? What is the future of energy? What is the future of housing? The list goes on and on. And I think if you just spend a little time just being curious of what the future could look like, you might be surprised at what you can see, right? People that invested in ed tech a decade ago said the future of learning is not in a physical classroom. It's on a tablet virtually. Let's break down the barriers. Well, that's to our benefit right now at this time and place.
Yes, that took a little longer than we would have expected. And honestly, the intriguing part about COVID-19, and it's hard to put a good spin on it, but you mentioned one with climate change and less pollution. But the advent of certain technologies relative to the advent of edtech, of likely augmented reality, which is not so great at the moment, it's going to get a lot better because working remotely and school remotely, part of this is going to be a keeper, and it's going to be beneficial from a climate and other perspective. Not a deep enough amount of time now to go into some of the social challenges of that and the interaction that we need as people. And that is one of the value of going to a college, is not just what you're learning, but how you're growing as a person, perhaps your first love, your first opportunity to be independent from parents. And if it's all only online, that's kind of pulled from you, but a subject for a different time.
Yeah, and I don't think we're going to 100% online tomorrow, right? I think you will have a combination. I think we just have to adapt to a world where we have to be able to operate in both worlds.
That's for sure. In the closing minute or so, for those that are interested in wanting to be more impactful with their investing, and although it was very helpful for them to listen to this or to watch it, they're going to want to learn more. How could they learn more about you and your organization, and how could they connect?
Great. Yeah, and there's lots of organizations out there. It's Align Impact, so alignimpact.com. And I would also say there's resources that we can provide you with in terms of books, podcasts, briefs, things that I like to tailor it to each family and how they digest information, rather than just assume someone wants to read a 300-page book. So please don't hesitate to reach out. My email is Jen with 2 N's at alignimpact.com. And I like to close with a call to action. So I just ask you to actually either look at what you're consuming and what that actually is supporting. Look at one of your grants and see, how can I actually take this to the next level? Or actually look at your portfolio and see, what do I actually own? Just one stock. What does that stock represent? And really dig into it. And I think you'll be surprised that one small action can actually have a rippling effect, and you can actually start your journey from there. Everyone is actually an impact investor. Every investment has impact, whether it's positive or negative. And in order to have the world we want to live in, Angelo, we need to have everyone join this movement.
Yeah, it's a great comment about impact investing. You are correct. Negative or positive, we're all effectively impact investors one way or another. You'd like to have a good impact, or at least what you perceive is going to be important to your principles, social norms, and values. In my close, everyone, I'm Angelo Robles, the host of Angelo Robles' Effective Family Office podcast. Thank you all for listening in, and our special guest, Jen. I'm also the founder and CEO at Family Office Association, a global membership organization dedicated to the interest of highly successful families and their single family offices, doing a tremendous amount of proprietary content and thought leadership, hosting events around the world, which are a little bit more limited now, but one day will come back, but really adapting in today's times and doing effectively what's daily virtual or online digital meetings, which has been very intriguing, allowed us a chance to expand more globally and to really redefine how we work and we live as well. So it's been very intriguing here at Family Office Association, and we have for sure, I've never been so busy. So it's been harder to do this than it is traveling around the country hosting events, which I used to think was fun. And now I'm beginning to think that maybe that is actually, I don't need to do as much of that as I have done in the past. The digital world is different and allows us a different mechanism of reaching people much more frequently and consistently, I might add. I could be reached on social media. My YouTube channel, where this video will be up, is simply Family Office. I'm active on Instagram as Family Office Association and very active on Twitter and LinkedIn. Website is familyofficeassociation.com or angelorobles.com. Thank you very much for watching or listening, depending on your medium that you did so. We hope you enjoyed it. And Jen, thank you so much for joining us today.